Any vulnerable and honest self-conversation that does not have some moment of challenge likely didn't walk through the right territory.
All right, friends, welcome. Thank you for being here tonight. Thanks for the folks who brought food. Can we give them a round of thanks, please? And someone did bring the sign up there, so I think there are opportunities for the next couple weeks. We appreciate that very much. Michael and I this week, a lot of conversation about why we thought this was a good idea, both kind of in general and then putting two relatively difficult conversations on the same evening, though in fairness, when you talk about something called 7 deadly sins, none of those conversations are going to be easy. We start tonight of the two, we have lust and gluttony. We begin with lust, and in I think some ways, lust is the most obvious of the deadly sins. You know, some of these, even with gluttony, we'll talk about gluttony not being just about food. Pride, of course, is multifaceted. Greed, we talked about the various ways. Lust is what you think it is. Lust is an obsession with physical pleasure, physical sensation, particularly sexual. Lust has always been a significant temptation and a significant importance, a significant caution in the Christian life. Sometimes we've gone too far. There have been branches in the Christian family that have essentially said we should never have any physical enjoyment and sex is only for making kids. And you know, that's on the far end. On the other end, we've kind of said, well, everybody do whatever you want and don't hurt anyone. And as always, I think Christian wisdom has been found trying to maintain that middle ground. Very interestingly, Michael and I talked about this significantly. Historically, it is surprising to us that lust was considered one of the, how would you say it, Michael? I don't want to say less dangerous. It was considered a kind of lesser sin. It was considered a physical sin and therefore less destructive than a spiritual sin. And it, I think, surprises us in the era we live in with sex being such a damaging force in church life and in personal life at times that our ancestors in the faith kind of said, yeah, it's a sin, but we have become maybe more wrapped up in the topic than the ancients, which is interesting.
Yeah, so at the outset of a conversation like this, I think we do need to do a little bit of work to make sure that we are making constructive paths forward instead of sort of just slotting into some cultural conversation. And what I mean by that is both lust and gluttony from a Christian vantage are generally going to be different than sort of the public conversation, sort of the idea that surrounds it. As it pertains specifically to lust, we have to chart a path that doesn't include some of the kind of moralized ideas about what you should and shouldn't do. What is a line that is crossing into lust and what isn't? It's not to say that the early church didn't care about crossing lines. Clearly, the adultery is one of the 10 Commandments, right? So identifying that was important. But what they had in mind was that there were some sins that were connected to what you might call your physical nature. Things connected, both of these share this, our conversations tonight. Both of them are rooted in something that as human is innate in our being. So either reproduction, which is what we're talking about now, or food, consumption of what we need to survive. Both of these are then misordered representations of a thing that is built in to our identity. And as it applies to lust, what the church had to say was that there are some sins like pride that are a fundamental reorientation of our entire spirit, such that if we allow ourselves to go down that road, that we become unto ourselves our own gods. And for them, we wouldn't say that it was a more important sin. That wouldn't be the correct language. But I do think that they might call that a more dangerous sin. And fundamentally, as they spoke about lust, what they spoke about was the misorderedness of when a human desire, which in another context would be right and good, can be both to others and to ourselves destructive. And it has in mind, certainly our physical inclination, our own sexual temptation. But, we also have this idea of, we would say that a person has a lust for power or a lust for money. There is a sense in which lust could be talked about as being an extreme misusing of any particularly good thing. But historically, the church has considered that to be part of our physical nature and our sexual temptation.
Yeah, so one of the authors said, lust is the least creative of the sins. It simply takes what God has called good in the context of relationship and reduces it to selfishness. So that lust is self-seeking pleasure, as opposed to mutual pleasure, as opposed to mutual attraction. Lust is a kind of lonely sin. And if you talk to people who have struggled with it, this is the language you'll hear, that they felt isolated. They felt empty. They felt ashamed. They felt alone. In the aftermath of acting upon lust, there is this kind of emptiness that people experience. And the ancients said that's what happens when you take one of the gifts that is meant for relationship and connection within the covenant context of love, and you abuse it selfishly. And in that way, I think, another author said lust is the wrong answer to the right question. And that question being, what do I want? What do I seek? What do I need? You know that, but then you pursue that selfishly. You pursue that casually. You pursue that easily. And that has a cost associated with it. And I think that's a helpful framework. The word lust in Greek is a combination of two words, inside and mind. And there's one of the authors says, and she says this really well, lust is almost always a problem above the belt before it's a problem below the belt. Meaning lust does begin in our impulses. It begins in our lingering glances. It begins in mental rehearsing before it becomes physical sin. And in that, I think lust is deceptive and dangerous because, and again, if you talk to people who have struggled with lust, it plants patterns. It plants libraries. It leaves things behind that then become part of the struggle. And I don't think in any era, this has always been the case, but I don't think in any era would that have been more true than in the internet era, where with your phone, with your computer, with anything, you have access to whatever that impulse directs you to. It is all out there. Now, it's always been all out there, but it's never been as accessible. And the statistics aren't good. I mean, if you look at the numbers of dollars that pornography generates, if you look at the usage rates, and probably most condemning for the church is that the rates between people who call themselves Christian and people who don't are really not different. Christians consume pornography and sexual material at about the same rate as non-Christians. Now, we may feel worse about it, but it doesn't really change the behavior. And, that's where we'll come back to this conversation. But I think I have developed a little different spin on our ancestors' understanding of lust. And we've had a lot of conversations this week about that. But the fundamental problem with lust is that it is selfish. It is self-gratifying by definition.
So the authors that I've read for this week, I think, tried to walk a very fine line. This is a difficult conversation because there are two very active camps as it relates to lust. On one hand, you have a church that, I'm sure this won't surprise you, especially in America, has very vocally spoken about what you should and shouldn't do. There's a lot of shame attached to the idea of sex and sexuality. And so there is a substantial kind of reputation that the church has of being prudes, of having no interest in sex or sexual life. Essentially, no fun is one image. That's one camp. Then the other side is, as long as nobody gets hurt, right? That's the basic idea. And then everything moves on from there. There's a whole section, even in Christianity, certainly culturally, that has no sort of impact that there should be any restraint of personal expression in any way. So the authors try to walk that line. They try to talk about creation, try to talk about how God made bodies, how in the midst of God making bodies, God declares the body to be good, and how we need to start from the vantage that God has blessed this thing, that God has ordered. That in fact, God throughout Scripture has a lot to say about blessing the human's ability to continue on from one generation to the next. So intrinsically, there's good in it. But then they flip that around to say that fundamentally, anytime we have a natural order that is not bent towards God and becomes destructive, we see it become a sinful force that needs to be repudiated. It needs to have boundaries and checks and balances like every other area of our life. And then they would try to generally transition into, so what do we do about the fact that we live in a society that has no boundary, right? The only boundary is one's personal comfort. And that's a very thorny conversation, because in the church, we can't conceive of talking about sin. We can't conceive of talking about right relationship without first looking at Jesus Christ, and then second, putting that in conversation within the church family writ large. And generally, that's where the author would turn at the end, is that we never, as people of faith, will follow in God's way without that in some way being communal, some way being honest about our shortcomings with one another. Of all of the sins, lust is certainly one of the most tempting to keep isolated. There's certainly that image of the screen in a dark room is very poignant as it relates to lust. But then you also have the reality that we will not grow as people of faith, and we won't be challenged to live up to the very highest calling that we have to embody Christ if we don't do that in the midst of Christian fellowship. Because, one of the dangers of lust, I don't want to push too long here, one of the dangers of lust is that you objectify the other for the sake of self-gratification. Lust is in some ways a very specific version of pride. Because fundamentally, what it suggests is that if I act on my lust, I should be able to gratify my physical desire at my time, at my desire, and in my own way. And so it's a reflection of a self-turn. The only way to correct for that, of course, besides forgiveness from Jesus Christ, is ultimately a community of saints who reminds us it's not about us. It's about other people, particularly if you're married, that person you've committed to. But it's also a matter of reflecting that it's not about instant gratification of self. It's about selflessness for the service of other.
Yeah, lust is a perversion of love. Again, lust takes a good thing and harnesses it to serve myself. And that therein lies its sinfulness. Again, some have said, C.S. Lewis said, the sins of the flesh are bad, but they're the least bad of all the sins. I wonder if C.S. Lewis would have made that comment had he lived in our era. I'm not sure. It's one of the things we've been having a conversation about. You may get a kick out of St. Augustine. Early in his conversion, early in his life, once prayed, Please, O Lord, deliver me from lust, but not yet. The repetitive nature of lust is a treadmill. Lust is also often a reaction to boredom, to restlessness. And again, I think in the era we live, that one of the dangers of sort of sinful sexuality is its repetitiveness, its addictiveness. It becomes a way of life for people. And when it does, it then inevitably damages relationships. Frederick Buechner had a wonderful quote. He said, our sexuality is like nitroglycerin. It can heal hearts or it can blow up bridges. That such is the power of that gift we've been given. But when it's misused, it is equally as destructive. And I think, that's very interesting. And I think, I think we all get, you don't have to watch television very long. We live in a sexualized culture. Oddly enough, though, we don't talk about it. We just display it everywhere. We show it. We see it. It's not really conversation. We don't have healthy conversations about sexuality. We use it to sell things. We put it in movies. It is everywhere and nowhere at the same time, which I think puts us in an interesting place as 21st century Christians. The temperance, the alternative or the antidote historically for lust is chastity. And, you talk about a word that doesn't get any traction. Chastity, people don't even know what it means. In fact, I noticed last time I preached this, I had recently been in conversation with my brother, which is not uncommon. My brother, you may know this, is a fire department chaplain in Kenosha where he lives. Been doing that a long time. Last time we had this conversation, I told the story. He had recently told me, it was again during Lent, and he had a conversation with a guy in the firehouse, and Lance asked him, how's it going? And the guy said, Chaplain, I'm really struggling. And he said, yeah, what's going on? He said, well, I gave up sex for Lent, and it's killing me. I'm struggling. And I said, whoa, well, how's his wife feel about it? My brother laughed and said, oh, he's not married. Right? So here's a guy talking to his equivalent pastor about his struggles, completely oblivious to the fact that what he's complaining about is our standard. Right? I mean, it's very interesting, the world we live. Michael and I, the vast majority of marriages we do are people living together, which, is not a criticism, but it's the landscape we live in. It is this kind of omnipresent reality. And so a word like chastity feels like a very outdated, a very old, ancient, trite kind of word. But chastity means discipline. It means faithfulness. Chastity, is not about the elimination of desire. Chastity is about the discipline to control it. And that kind of self-control, in fact, maybe that's what we should replace that word with. The idea of self-control, of simply, and I don't want to make this sound like it's easy, because it's not, but of simply not doing some of those things and getting new patterns, of setting new standards in our lives, of saying, I don't think that's in keeping with following Jesus, and finding a way, getting some help, talking to people, getting accountability to try and change our behaviors. And I think, there's a lot to gain in that word for a lot of people, but it's not a word that we celebrate.
You glad you came for soup now? The truth is that we may become uncomfortable in the midst of a conversation like this and miss what I think is the current that lives underneath. And here, I think Willimon says this really well. He says, I wonder if in our culture there's so much sexual passion and so little desire for God because sex has become the last means of self-transcendence. I think there is deep wisdom in that. I think we live in a time, goodness gracious, I get a lot of things I order online in one day now. Like to wait 2 days is too long, right? We live in a moment in which entire applications for phones have been developed to shorten the period of time from having a sexual desire to being able to act on it. The reality is that because we live in this pattern of sensing a need, or maybe even not a need, maybe like Clint says, maybe boredom, maybe simply the flatlining of I'm not having a great time right now is enough to stir our souls and to move us to want to feel something transcendent, something beyond ourselves. It would be the same logic used for any other addictive substance, whether that be gambling or whether that be drugs. But we have an internal physical thing that we can turn to, that in a moment, in a fleeting, half-hearted moment, feels transcendent. And of course we know on the back end of any experience that it doesn't last. It's short term. It does not have the power to truly shape and change us. But yet, as we continue to search and find new ways to hook into this physical need, as people literally market it, and by the way, let's not pass by too quickly. Entire economies have been created around this. And I don't just mean economic ones. I mean people, right? People are literally traded for the sake of lust. And if we don't recognize the ways in which these habits of a stirring within us and then an action that we take, a half-hearted, and not by half-hearted, I don't mean half-intended. I mean an action that could never outone ourselves, an action that could never be enough to stick. We allow that narrative to trick us until over and over and over again, we get caught and find ourselves far away, nowhere along that path having intended to let that ship go out to sea. But we find ourselves one day, that action and that pattern has moved us, and lust has grown from just a thought to a pattern of action. And when that happens, we of course won't find the transcendence we're looking for. But I think it does make the voice of the church very compelling, where we say that fundamentally you will never find fullness in a thing that you do. You will only find fullness in the gift that's been given. And that gives us the beginning of a conversation that I think is very countercultural and in some ways maybe gives us an opportunity to push back on some of the things that are taken for granted culturally.
So, to some extent, this would be true of any of our struggling with sin, but there's a kind of a fun story that one of the authors tells. There's a revival, and there's a man in town who's pretty well known that he runs around a lot, got a pretty loose set of morals. And he goes to the revival, and he finds himself up front, and he gets saved, says the prayer, gets really excited. And the pastor sees this, the community pastor, he runs into the guy a week or so later. How's it going? He says, Pastor, this is so hard. He said, I'm trying to do the right thing. I'm trying to leave my old life behind. He said, I feel like there's two teams of horses going two different directions, and it's pulling me apart. And the pastor says, well, which team of horses wins? And he says, well, so far, whichever one I tell, giddy up. Right? And again, if you've lived through those struggles, the wisdom of that story is the beautiful, simple truth of it, that there is a point in which discipline is to say no. It's to say to this horse, giddy up, and not that one. It is to say yes here and no here. And again, I don't mean to throw that out there like it's easy. I'm not a just say no guy. I don't think that's a helpful way to talk about temptation. But there is some truth to the reality that we do need to set new patterns, because if we follow the sinful pattern, if we follow lust, lust will take us further down that road. It doesn't leave us where we are. Sin is not content to let us stay a certain way. It is an anchor that continues to drag us. And I think that while that's true in all of the sins, I do think that is particularly relevant as we have this conversation. And I do think, again, that word chastity, maybe especially reframed as self-discipline, is a challenge for us to be able to try and do that. So let's stop there for a minute. Comments, questions? Can I say this? You guys promise you won't be mad? You ever get that from your kid? Can I tell you something, but I don't want you to be mad?
Can I have immunity?
I think it was Williman who said that he noticed that the older he got, the less lust was a problem. And I've just sort of laughed about that and the idea that we're having this conversation on lust, and most of you all are retired, and I don't know how relevant it is or isn't, but I do think, the ancients put it out there for us, and so we'll talk about it.
So I'll give. We'll let Williman maybe have the word on that. Yeah, he said this, and I think that this, for me, communicates the universal import of this particular, even if difficult, conversation. He says, in a world of untutored, unbridled desire, we tend to grab at everything out of the fear that we might neglect to seize the one thing that would give our lives meaning. Thus, the lines between greed, envy, and lust become blurred. And I think that is a very helpful way into this conversation, is to say that yes, the church does have a long conversation about the right use of our bodies, but the thing that fundamentally gnaws at us is the fear of being left out. I mean, kids these days have a term for it, right? FOMO, fear of missing out. That there's like t-shirts and water bottles with that on it. The human fear that we might miss out on that experience, or that we might miss out on that opportunity, can be so great that it enables, to go back to our previous conversations, the way that these sins work in on one another, so that maybe lust isn't the foothold. Maybe that's not the first seed that gets planted. But as we discover that fear grows, and as our own sense of pride and as greed sets in, and then we begin to become envious of another, as those kinds of things grow and flourish into this strange kind of destructive cocktail, that is maybe when we begin to experience the real sort of force and power of that rhythm of lust. I'm not sure that it's fair to put lust in its own tunnel, to say that it's its own thing and it's either a problem or it's not. I think it also lives in a relationship with these other things, and one can easily flow to the other if not left checked.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should acknowledge that while we may feel some of the discomfort and we laugh at some of the stories and the quotes and things, every person in here knows someone whose lives were deeply affected by a moment of lust, whether that be adultery or whether that be a sexual assault, a rape. I mean, they are some of the most destructive. I promise everyone in here knows of a church where a pastor got himself or herself in trouble, right? Teachers. I mean, we have all seen it. We all know that it's there, and we shouldn't minimize. This is one of the pushbacks I'd like to have conversation with about the monks who say, well, it's the least harmful of this. I'm not. I think it leaves some very, very deep wounds, and I think we do have to acknowledge that as well. Okay, we'll move on. We'll try to do this timely. Our second topic tonight is gluttony. This is really interesting. In fact, of the 7 sins, I would say that this is the one that I'm sort of dreading the most. All of the authors kind of point out that, ironically, in a culture that celebrates most of the 7 deadly sins, we've talked about that, greed is good and pride is good and lust is great. Our culture, the one bias our culture seems to have is gluttony. And not gluttony per se, but the idea of overweight. If there is a group of people that are kind of looked at suspiciously culturally, it's not those who have done lust or greed or pride. It is those who may be heavy. And we just want to put that out there. That is not a judgment on anybody, but it is a bias. I think all of the books are making the interesting case that this is really the only sin that our culture sort of acknowledges as a sin, but it does so in a very pointed and almost a destructive way, a shame-inducing way, not an empowering way, not an encouraging way, but a judgmental way. A couple of things as we start. The first sin, if you read, Michael mentioned Genesis. If you read the early part of Genesis, our first sin was an eating sin, right? Humans' fall happened through food. The ancient Israelites, we think it's odd, but the Jewish people still practice it. The idea of clean and unclean food, of what God says you can eat and what God says you shouldn't eat. In the New Testament, Paul deals with food sacrificed to idols. There's Christians who at their meat market get food that was used in temples. They didn't have trucking lines in grocery stores. The animals went to temple and then they came to the market. And so the Christians asked Paul, can we eat that? If that lamb has been in somebody's temple to some pagan god, is it tainted? Is it okay for us to eat it? I tell you that to say that really we have no equivalent to that. The average modern person, I would guess that the only thing you've ever asked of your food is, should I eat it in regard to health or weight? We simply do not carry the idea that food has a moral component to it. And gluttony asks us at some level to reconsider that. And I think this is a difficult conversation for us for a couple reasons. Most of us, maybe our weight isn't what we want, but this isn't a weight conversation. This is about how food gets used as a salve, or as a kind of in the same way of lust, a way of trying to address inner turmoil. It's a matter of our attentiveness and our desire towards a thing. So gluttony is a sin of the flesh, but I think it's a struggle for us to wrap our heads around it.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful. Listen, Dr. Phil's a thing, right? And all of the people who come on TV and promise weight loss products. I think I just saw an advertisement for a thing that was going to make you lose 30 pounds in a day. And, there was, we live in a culture in which you don't even need to hardly turn on the TV or the radio to find some reminder that you need to care about food. And by the way, that's with the fact that most of us driving home from work or from being with our friends, we have to pass 8 restaurants on the way, right? And realistically, we as people of faith have this interesting balance, because if you think of the scriptures, there is both fasting and feasting, right? Jesus goes to the wedding, and there he celebrates, and it's this beautiful thing. Of course, at the Last Supper, it's a meal that Jesus uses to exemplify this lasting gift he's going to give the church. And then on the other hand, when is Jesus most tempted before he begins his ministry? Well, by fasting in the wilderness. That's when Satan comes after him to tempt him. We might think of this, and we might be tempted to go down the road to make this fit a cultural conversation, and that is the concern about what will this food do to my body, or what would other people think if I eat it. I mean, this is just prescient and part of our framework. That I would argue is not particularly helpful from a Christian vantage. And I think one of our authors here, I thought, offered a really helpful frame. So I want to offer it to you. They offered this sort of acronym called FRESH. And they said, if you work this out, that this is a fuller definition of gluttony. That FRESH would be eating fastidiously, we'll talk about that in a second, ravenously, excessively, sumptuously, and hastily. And every single one of these describing an orientation or a use of food that is not for the sake of nourishing our bodies, or it's not for the sake of even just the enjoyment of the meal, but rather filling some other either perceived or unperceived hole in our hearts. And so an example that every author gave I thought was really helpful. C.S. Lewis wrote in his one of his books, a woman who, I believe this was Screwtape Letters, who was tempted by Satan with the sin of gluttony. But it wasn't the sin of eating a lot of food, which is what we might think, but rather she would go to people's hosts who were hosting her and say, I only want a little bit of tea and just a slice of toast with just a little bit of butter. And C.S. Lewis makes the case that this woman is struggling with the sin of gluttony, not because she's eating a lot, but because she's using food to point to herself. She's unwilling to take the food hosted and given to everyone else, and requires the host to give her something special just for her. So food then, on its own, became a tool to self. And this being, therefore, an example of how gluttony can be more than just what we think of in terms of, did I eat too much, or was the food not healthy? This idea of ways and times and tools that we use to take food to fill a hole or to point in a direction that is not helpful, that's not holy.
Yeah, so again, we want to be careful that gluttony isn't just overindulgence, though that historically is. It's an overfixation. And so in my younger life, I was a wrestler. In that period of wrestling, you cut the weight, you make your weight, so the day or two before you have to weigh in, you're not eating very much. And I lived for food. In those 3-4 day windows where it was time to get rid of the last however many pounds, right? You just think, oh, if I go for a 4-mile run, I can have an apple, right? And then if I do 100 push-ups, I'll let myself get some water, or I'll eat a carrot, but then I have to do it. And so it was an absolute fixation, and it was gluttonous because it consumed my thoughts. Now, I wasn't getting bigger, if anything, the opposite, right? But it is not just overdoing, it is overthinking. And we live in a weird culture. It is very hard to communicate how historically odd we are as 21st century Americans when it comes to food, right? We have an industry that is trying to take calories out of what we eat. We have an industry giving us things to eat that have no nutritional value, so we can eat them without really eating. We have a multi-billion dollar industry that is promoting how to lose weight we gain from overeating. And most ironic, I think, in the history of the world, the lower your income level, the more likely you are to be large, the more likely you are to have food-related, obesity-related kind of health conditions. Historically, gluttony was seen as a way of not caring about the poor. It was that you had too much while other people didn't have enough. We live in an era in which that narrative is flipped upside down, but really only for us. And we should be aware of that, because historically and globally, that's not the case. Anybody see that? It was not I don't know if it was a great movie. There's a movie called End of the Spear. It was about a missionary. Anybody? Yeah, it wouldn't matter. So there's this man in it. He's from this lost tribe in Ecuador, and they go and the missionaries meet them, and then they bring him to the United States, and he's wandering around the city barefoot, and then they show him going back to his tribe, and they record the conversation he has. And this is part of what he says. He says, all the people there are so fat, they can't really walk. They ride in chariots, and even their sidewalks move, because he was at the airport. He says, then you go to these homes where they have a food window, and they give you food out of the window. And then you go to the food house where they store piles of food, whatever you want, and you stand in line and they pretend they don't see you, but then they see you and smile and they give you all the food for free. Well, you give them something, but they give it back to you because he didn't understand change. And then he said they don't hunt and they don't garden. And all of the people he's talking to, they start shaking their head and they tell him, you're crazy. And he says, no, they get all their food from the food places. And he said, this is why they're all big. Because of course there's nothing to this man. And you think from that perspective, imagine if you could come from most of the places on the globe where food is a daily struggle, and you could get dropped into our life. And you could, on your way home tonight, go by the grocery store and stand in front of 30 kinds of pickles. Right? I mean, it is, we live in an unimaginable circumstance in regard to food, and we don't remember that often enough. Food is a struggle, interestingly enough, not just when you have it, it's a struggle when you have more than you need of it as well.
So the authors went to great length to talk about, we may be, once again, because of our cultural sort of idea, we may think of gluttony specifically as it relates to the amount of food, but each author took time, and I thought helpfully, to make the case that it's not just about the food, it's also about the relationships that gather around the food. As you know, the people at table make a substantial difference, especially in the historic Christian faith. And I'm sure either kids or grandkids, or you've been at some sort of event where you've seen kids eat their meal. If eat is the right word, probably shovel is probably the better word, right? As kids, there's no way they tasted that food, right? It just sort of went straight down their throat. And you've been in it at some event, I'm certain, where you've been with someone, and it's just them and their food. Right? I mean, it's like they're dialed in on that plate, man. And then when conversation's over and that food's gone, they're gone. They walk away. That's a form of gluttony, because fundamentally the table and the food did not become a bridge for relationship, but rather it became an opportunity to serve self. You see that turn, right? That's, I think, where the Christian conversation begins to be helpful, is instead of it becoming a series of condemnations about what we should or shouldn't do, which quite frankly, we get enough of that. I think it becomes for us an invitation to see that scripturally there's a beautiful kind of library of images in the ways in which food should represent for us God's provision. The table, whenever you sit at it, should be a reminder that God is caring for both your physical and spiritual needs. How many of you pray before a meal? Right? That shouldn't just be ritual. That is intended to be a reminder both to self and a offering of thanksgiving to God for the thing on the table. I am guilty with all the rest of that being a rote process. I sit down and do this thing because that's what I do. But the table should be an opportunity to be connected to others and connected to God. And whenever we listen, I don't know what the most expensive meal you've eaten is. I'd be ashamed to tell you what that is for me, right? But when you go, and the only reason for which that plate has been put in front of you is because that food is really good, right? Or it's super authentic, or whatever the case may be. If the only thing that matters is that plate, then we've missed an opportunity. Does that make sense? If we make it about the experience or about the food itself, then it's not about the one who made the food. It's not about the one who's gifted us with the opportunity and the blessing to continue to live by the strength of that food. Anything that stands in between us and God is fundamentally a thing that the church is going to call us to give up.
Right. So again, there's a helpful quote here. Until we tame the enemies that dwell within us, we will not be able to engage in real spiritual combat. And that's the idea of gluttony, that we have something that is trying to fill the hole that only God can inside of us, that we look to food for a measure of comfort. We look to food for a measure of escape. And for the person who struggles with that, whether on either side, eating too much or not eating enough, not caring for the body, because they're hiding behind that, food becomes then not a gift, but something we punish ourselves with, physically or spiritually. And that's, again, it's a very interesting conversation where we live. I was Monday. What night was Jane? Monday. So I got sick early in the week. I think it was Monday, and didn't have a lot of sleep Monday night. So I had on the couch. Luckily, Jane was at a conference, so I didn't have to worry about that. But I didn't make it off the couch to go, walk the 40 feet back to the bedroom or whatever. And so I had the TV on all night, and somewhere around, 3:30 in the morning. Can't remember what I was watching. I saw this commercial. I've never seen it before. It was for diet pills, not diet pills, the opposite of diet pills. There were all these very thin people who said, I took this pill and I gained 40 pounds. One said, I gained 53 pounds in however many weeks. And it didn't say if it was like an appetizer stimulant. The idea that, people, and I thought, you're only seeing that. That commercial only exists in America. There's just no place else that somebody said, I've got this product that will help people be bigger. How do we get it in front of them? We have such a strange relationship with food. It's omnipresent, and we don't think much of it. And we certainly don't think of it as an extension of our spiritual life. Not legalistically, as in, should I eat that? Would a Christian eat, whatever? But what is my overall relationship with it? And do I ever look to food as a Band-Aid for an internal struggle? And I mean, that's the heart of what has been called gluttony. And, I think when we frame it that way, almost all of us can admit that if it hasn't been an issue, we've at least bumped into it. We at least, oh yeah, I can kind of understand that. And I think that's a helpful way to frame it.
Maybe by way of summarizing, if you thought that our first conversation was hard, maybe you thought the second is harder. Willman says, we flatter ourselves in thinking that we are a sex-obsessed culture. Food is really our cultural downfall and obsession.
Yeah, and not to jump, he follows that up with, perhaps gluttony is a particular problem in a society of instant gratification where we pursue cheap thrills and want momentary satisfaction. So again, I'm not beating up America. We're all glad to live here. We all don't want to trade, but your upsides have some downsides, and that seems to be one of them.
So I think by way of conclusion, I just want to say thank you for sitting through what's not a easy conversation. One of the authors wrote this. This is precisely why the Desert Fathers and Mothers practice scrutinizing their thoughts, and they prize discretion about their emotional reactions. They are wary of the cumulative effect of indulged desire. They might first instruct us to exercise greater watchfulness and more frequent self-examination. And if there's any better summary of what Lent is, that is it. Any vulnerable and honest self-conversation that does not have some moment of challenge likely didn't walk through the right territory. And so, I'm grateful that we can have a conversation, and we can, if you have any experience like at least I've had this week, as I've read some challenging materials, it's not in the first reading of it. It's in the second or third or fourth thought that follows from it. And there's great opportunity that comes from the kind of honest self-assessment and raising of those questions. Because you tend to see things. I don't know if you've seen this before, but you ever see like a car in the car lot that's new to you, or you've never seen it? Oh, that's an interesting car. And then suddenly you see that car everywhere on the road, right? Like everyone's driving that kind of car. Never saw it before. I think that's the case with this. Maybe you haven't thought about lust, or maybe gluttony's not been a thing that has been in your reflection. I wonder if maybe in the next week you might find that thought that comes across and you think, oh, now that's a thing that I can work on. If so, then hopefully we've done something of value.
Thank you all for your time. Thanks again for the food, and appreciate you all being here this evening.